Well, here we are, 30 minutes until the start of trading, awaiting the debut of SpaceX on the NASDAQ. I'm David Gura.
It's been a while coming, David. I'm Bonnie Quinn. Matt Miller and Dani Berger are off. Bloomberg Open Interest starts right now.
Well, coming up, the countdown is underway. SpaceX trades today after raising $75 billion in what is the largest IPO ever.
Shadow market signaling a blockbuster debut, putting Elon Musk on the brink of becoming the world's first trillionaire.
And hopes for peace are also helping boost sentiment across markets today as the U.S. and Iran edge closer to a deal.
A nice alignment there. The market seems to be primed for some kind of a bounce today. Stocks to watch. Well, we're looking at the AI trade ahead of that SpaceX debut. Shares popped earlier on the prospect of a US-Iran deal, which seemed more likely than ever after the president said yesterday he was going to put off a third round of strikes last night and a deal was close. Well, here are some shares. Alphabet, of course, has a big stake in SpaceX. Alphabet, no doubt, will move on the prospects for SpaceX today.
Our focus, of course, on SpaceX, the company and its prospects, but so many businesses in the broader space industry paying attention to how this goes, looking at sort of what this means for their fortunes going forward, taking a look here at stocks in that broader space industry. A volatile day, I think, like a lot of folks, wondering sort of what's going to happen here as all of this plays out as we await trading on the NASDAQ. But you see shares mixed in EchoStar, Rocket Lab, and AST Space Mobile. Continue to watch those throughout the day as you kind of look through that prospectus that SpaceX released, forecasting a radically different future, so much opportunity in space, portending here a new economy, a space economy. We'll see how other companies fit into that going forward. Vonnie?
All right, David. Well, as we've been saying, SpaceX set to make its market debut in the largest IPO in history. It's a landmark moment for both Wall Street and the space industry.
I think this feels like a milestone moment. This was an investment thesis that was unthinkable a decade ago for most investors.
SpaceX is the biggest rising star of all time. They have no net debt.
Right.
So it's clearly an IG-rated company as we stand today.
I'm actually quite bullish and optimistic for its impact on the industry. I think there's going to be a lot of capital that flows back into other space names as well.
SpaceX is one of the most important infrastructure projects of our time and really a very big cash generator.
What SpaceX is doing is actually integrating not just across its space technologies, but it's creating infrastructure on Earth and in space to basically do a lot of AI compute.
Joining us at the desk now for this hour is Bloomberg Tech co-host Ed Ludlow. He's been reporting on SpaceX and Tesla, of course, for years. Ed, of course it's investment grade. It's going public today. Does it stay investment grade? And how many times does it go back to the market?
I think the significance of the reporting there is that we're very fixated on the biggest IPO in history, and they'll raise $75 billion, and that's astonishing what they'll use the proceeds for, pay down some debt. But capital expenditure, right? It's highly analogous with what we see in the hyperscaler space. And the expectation on that IG rating significance is they'll come back to the markets in some form, right? Equity or debt. This year was about a race to IPO. SpaceX, Anthropic, OpenAI. Actually, the way that lots of investors who have exposure to all three companies, they've got a bit of a headache on their hands, is that it's a race for capital, with Alphabet coming in strong into the equity market and everyone else probably coming quickly to follow suit.
I picked up the prospectus from Rocket Road there in Starbase, Texas, 200-plus pages. I know you've read them all. And I myself didn't read all of them, but I was drawn to this kind of caveat emptor in the document. Our growth strategy may take longer to execute than anticipated. Right. You may not realize a return on your investment within the time frame you anticipate, or at all. That clause there stuck with me.
Yeah, SpaceX management has been clear that the timelines and horizons for the story they're telling, the vision of being an AI company where the total addressable market is $26.5 trillion, it will take time to get there. What's interesting about that is, like, right now, however we trade today, right, it's a moment in time. There's not as much emphasis being put on the, well, what is it that they currently do? And what they currently do is have the Starlink business, which in 25 was profitable in isolation, cash flow positive, although there isn't a cash flow number in the prospectus. And they've become a neocloud. They rent data center capacity to Google, which happens to be one of their biggest investors, and Anthropic, on paper one of their biggest rivals. And you know, what's so interesting is behind closed doors, a lot of these venture and growth mutual funds that are already on the cap table tell me, you know, we actually not paying too much attention to that long distant future business model. We're pretty stoked about the current business and how they've hedged with this data center plan.
Doesn't it remind you of when Amazon suddenly realized it had a cloud business and that's what paid for everything else for a moment in time there?
Yeah, it's highly analogous to that. The cash cow in the interim period will be SpaceX through XAI is very good at building data centers and running them on the best dollar per token basis. And they can't work out how to use all of the capacity themselves to train their own or run their own models. So they're saying, well, someone else can use it in isolation, and we'll make money from that.
Ed, you're going to stick with us, not just for this block, but for the entirety of the hour as SpaceX makes its market debut today. A huge question is whether markets can absorb another mega cap AI play as concerns continue to grow about AI spending and returns. I want to discuss those market implications now with Bloomberg macro strategist Michael Ball, who joins us here on set in New York as well. Let's pull back here. I mentioned at the top a lot of space industry participants watching this unfold. More broadly than that, there were a lot of gigantic companies poised to go public who are waiting to see how this goes as well.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. One, the market narrative right now is clearly either Iran. It's clearly this kind of rethinking of the AI trade, winners and losers, where capacity is constrained, where it's not, who has the pricing power, and then obviously the SpaceX. And the SpaceX feeds back into your question here, buybacks versus new issuance. And this is the first year where we're seeing that actually look a little flattish. And we don't know yet where Anthropic obviously is going to be and where OpenAI is going to be, so that will add to the pile. But as it stands right now, it's more balanced. So that like tailwind that's been around for several years, and it's always been this passive flow, constantly being kind of leaned into as there's going to be buyers coming in from the corporate side, is no longer as assured.
Why set the price pre-IPO $135? Is there precedent for this?
Well, there is usually some setting of the price, but to your point, why at that level? I think that's probably where they thought they could get the best deal. And again, we'll find out today when it opens how much it goes up. And I get your point because the shadow markets are showing a little bit of a higher premium to that. And that, you know, the murmur among traders is it could fly, given how much it's been subscribed. But I don't really have a great answer for exactly why that level. I think they all got together in a room and decided that was where it should be.
What I jump in and say is, like, you know, our reporting is that unusually, even though the bankers will make a lot of money from this transaction, Elon Musk and the rest of the SpaceX management team had very firm control behind setting 135 early. What's so interesting, right, is that it's way oversubscribed on the institutional side and on the retail side. All you can trade today in the session is whatever was put into the market on the float. Like, how does that work?
Yeah. I mean, again, this is my worry, that there's going to be a spike. You're going to see some beneficiaries with it, especially like the Googles who have a stake in it, especially some of the other tangent plays, especially the neo clouds, because it's showing, again, that's where the capacity constraints are. And we're going to have maybe a gamma squeeze as well, because we have the froth has come out in the last 2 weeks. We've all seen that. We've seen a more volatile tape. We've seen it in the semis. We've seen it in the NASDAQ. That's been especially the area that was overbought and the option markets were showing us. So now we've kind of had a chance to reload. Things aren't as long, so there's a chance now for everyone to pile back in. And for the last 2 or 3 weeks, retail and institutional trading have been in lockstep. And back to Ed's point, they're in lockstep again going into this IPO, which again gives us dry powder that can really ramp things up and make for an interesting show. Then again, of course, how long do we stay at these levels and what's the implications further out for volatility?
But also the size of oversubscription is relative, right? So 4 times oversubscribed is not normally a huge amount oversubscribed. It's just that this is a massive IPO, and so therefore maybe it's a little more than usual. Yeah, it's
big part of it. I think we've never seen anything like it. I've been pushing back on the traders and PMs I'm talking to who are getting experts telling them things. I think we don't really have anything to really look at in the past to gauge this as. And also, again, it is a certified neo-cloud thing we understand, but then there's this dream further out that's obviously Elon's done in other ways with Tesla and stuff as well. So if anyone says they think they know where this is going right now, I would just say, let's wait and see.
Michael, we will be chatting to you throughout the morning. That is Bloomberg macro strategist Michael Ball, and Ed Ludlow is sticking with us. And don't miss a special edition of Bloomberg Tech at 11 a.m. Eastern, then an exclusive conversation with Jim Chanos, who said this is an IPO that's built on hope. That conversation on Bloomberg Money at noon. The US and Iran are edging closer to signing an agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, according to senior officials. A deal could be signed next week during the G7 summit near Geneva. Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall has the details. What changed right before the market closed yesterday, Tyler? It suddenly seemed that the president was a lot more enthusiastic, and then Mayor came out this morning and gave somewhat of support to what the president had said.
Right, Vonnie, we're tracking a few different developments today, but the overarching theme here is that G7 officials tell Bloomberg News that a senior Iranian official last night did indicate that a deal is likely. There seems to be this renewed hope that they are getting towards a diplomatic solution, though our reporting does caution that Iran has not said that it is ready to sign just yet and that any agreement still needs Iran's supreme leader's approval. Now, we've been tracking that the two sides are working towards a memorandum of understanding that would first seek to extend the ceasefire by 60 days. Then we would see a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz prioritized within the first 30 days and the U.S. lift its naval blockade. Once those components are in place, then we could expect those longer-term discussions around what potential curbs to Iran's nuclear program would look like. But we got a flurry of reports out from Iranian state media today about some of the provisions and what is reportedly the 14 points in this agreement that could prove problematic, including that Iran is saying that they will not restore the Strait of Hormuz to pre-war levels, seeming to indicate that they want to retain some sort of grip over the waterway, even if a deal is reached. Keep in mind, about 140 ships used to transit through the strait before the conflict began. But then there were some of these other provisions included, too, including that the U.S. would have to withdraw assets from the region, unfreeze half of Iran's frozen assets, and suspend oil sanctions. At this point, Vonnie, we'll have to see what the U.S. actually agrees to in any sort of final agreement. But the White House at this point is still pointing towards that they are pushing for this deal and that they have conferred with regional allies.
Could happen as soon as Sunday, according to Bloomberg's reporting. A lot to get to before then, including the president's birthday, Flag Day, of course, and that cage match on the south lawn of the White House. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall from Washington, thank you very much for that update. And let's do a quick check of the markets here as we await trading to begin in SpaceX. We see S&P futures up here about 1/5%. NASDAQ and NASDAQ is down slightly this morning. Again, a lot of volatility ahead of this, looking at the 10-year coming in some as well. And Brent crude below $90 a barrel. I should say that's significant because we haven't seen it there below that 90 threshold since the first week of the war that we were just talking about, Vonnie.
Well, David, let's get a look at some other movers on our radar. Adobe down after the CFO announced he's leaving the company. In March, the CEO of Adobe said he would resign later this year. AMD shares, though, are popping on a city upgrade to buy. Demand for its GPUs there. And these stocks are all set to join the NASDAQ 100. You have a little bit of everything here. You have the Neo Clouds, CoreWeave and Nebius. You have Astera Labs. And, of course, a space play, Rocket Lab.
Well, coming up here, Elon Musk poised to become the world's first trillionaire. Musk's worth would be more than the GDP of Taiwan. Dig into his prospects here going forward. This is Bloomberg Open Interest. Now to high interest, to look at what's making headlines around the world. Some New York City brides are choosing bing bongs over wedding bells as the Knicks NBA Finals run collides with weekend nuptials. Couples who booked venues years ago are adding big screen TVs, score updates, and team decor to keep their guests from watching the game on their phones. Some receptions are becoming full-fledged Knicks watch parties as the team chases its first title since the year 1973. Vanguard has unseated BlackRock as the largest U.S. ETF issuer for the first time in over 20 years. Vanguard now manages about $4.39 trillion in ETF assets, driven by nearly $291 billion in inflows this year and surging demand for VOO, its low-cost S&P 500 fund, which recently topped $1 trillion in assets. And Goldman Sachs President John Waldron says a record-breaking SpaceX IPO has investors racing to fund the future. He spoke exclusively to Bloomberg TV's Francine Lacqua earlier today.
It's a $75 billion IPO, the largest in history. I think it presages the beginning of a pretty sizable wave of IPOs, which we're excited about. I also think it shows you that the capital markets, led by the U.S. capital markets, but the global capital markets are demonstrating a willingness to finance this AI infrastructure build and this build in space, which is quite exciting.
Here's a look at the NASDAQ market site right now. Elon Musk poised to become the first trillionaire if SpaceX stock closes above 2% higher today after its IPO. Let's discuss with Bloomberg Businessweek columnist Max Chafkin. He's covered Elon Musk for years, and of course Ed Ludlow is still with us, host of Bloomberg Tech. Max, let me start with you. I'm tempted to ask, would becoming a trillionaire change Elon Musk in any way, or how would it change him? But in all seriousness, would he be satisfied then? Clearly pay is important to him. He's made it a serious part of board discussions.
I think that pay is important to him insofar as it's sort of a scoreboard of his achievement. As well, like, he has big ambitions here. He's attempting to, invest huge sums of money in the political system. There's big plans here with SpaceX. Of course, now the hope would be that, the public is going to fund SpaceX plan rather than Elon Musk personally. But, he is somebody who has cared about, he may not care about material wealth or his house. That's what he always says. But he is somebody who's been very, very focused on his personal wealth, his pay. We've seen these fights over pay packages for years. He even, in an exchange on X earlier this year, corrected someone, insisted that he was a trillionaire, I guess a little prematurely. So this is, he has been focused on his net worth, even if he says he's not focused on material wealth.
Let me stick with focus, but in a different light here, and that is how he's going to be able to run this company when it goes public, when he has other things kind of drawing his attention. He is the techno king of Tesla. I believe that's the official term. It's in the prospectus that I mentioned earlier. Any concern among these legions of retail investors who are going to be backing him today about his capacity to do this and that simultaneously?
I don't think there's any concern among the legion of retail investors. That's what they're betting on. I think when you talk to institutional investors, maybe there are people who will quietly say that this is a concern, and we saw this risk factor come up with Tesla, that was the justification for paying him this latest huge pay package, that there was a risk that he would take his AI ball and play elsewhere. I think this is why so many people think that Tesla and SpaceX are eventually going to merge, that you have two companies run by the same person, they're both kind of doing the same thing, and you have shareholder bases that have essentially the same thesis, which is Elon Musk is great, we're going to follow him to the moon.
There's a massive distinction between economic ownership and voting power. Mm-hmm. And Musk is going to come out of this IPO 84% voting power at SpaceX, which, when Max and I over the last 12 months were writing about Elon's world, and particularly the Tesla, the whole pay package point, he would argue, would he not, Max, it's about control. He can only execute the vision that he's outlining if he's not at risk from activist investors and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And this setup at SpaceX is complete control. I mean, not just the 85% voting control, but also the fact that they've moved it from Delaware to Texas, where the courts are set up in a way that's much more favorable to management. You also have provisions in this IPO around arbitration for shareholder class actions. Basically, no one is going to be able to force Musk to do what he wants. The only thing that can force him is the stock market. Mm-hmm. Is the fact that if the stock market doesn't like this plan, doesn't believe in the idea of space data centers, which I think is very possible, especially as, depending on what happens with the AI market in general, then I think that could force changes.
So SpaceX is already a conglomerate, right? X was brought into XAI, and now they're all part of SpaceX. Is there a point at which Tesla becomes part of the conglomerate as well? Ed, let me ask you. And in that situation, nobody could complain that he wasn't being able to give time to each company, because essentially he's giving time to their conglomerate.
The idea is out there in the market. We reported prior to the XAI and SpaceX merger that both boards had met and discussed the idea of a SpaceX and Tesla merger anyway, and that there was a large group of SpaceX investors that basically went to Elon and the rest of SpaceX management and were like, this makes much more sense to go with Tesla. In this IPO, yes, retail's massively oversubscribed. There are loads of Tesla shareholders that did not buy shares in the IPO or try to get an allocation because they think that's going to happen anyway. Why bother? You'll get your comp or your reward if the transaction were to happen.
It is also a way to kind of address some of the issues at Tesla. You remember, look at Tesla, and what you have is kind of a troubled car company and as the investors see it, a very promising AI thing. if Tesla is not able to kind of get its car business on the right track pretty quickly, either by, bringing lots more robo-taxis to the market. Right now, they just have a few dozen in a couple of cities that are, operating unsupervised. If they aren't able to sort of find some new gear in terms of automotive sales, this could be a way to say, okay, we don't need to worry about being a car company. Now we're just going to be part of this amazing vertically integrated AI rocket ship.
So we watched the proceedings there at the NASDAQ trading floor. I just want to point that out. Yes, the head of the company. You mentioned the boards having talked to one another, and in the minute that we have left here, Ed, I'm curious about that, the power that this board will have, if any. You've talked about his capacity to pick who's going to be on that board and to relieve them if he wants. Notoriously, Elon Musk's boards don't have much power to push back on what he's doing.
Hopefully everyone else read the prospectus like you did, but basically, his comp for SpaceX is based on restricted shares that he has to hit market cap milestones to get, but also establish a permanent human colony on Mars. Yes, a permanent human colony on Mars in order to unlock his compensation. That's the board's control. They had it written into the doc that the board of SpaceX think about its composition. Sure.
I do my own research, Ed Ludlow. Thank you very much. You're going to stick with us. Max Chafkin, Bloomberg Businessweek columnist, host of Everybody's Business, with us here on set as well. And coming up, we're going to talk about the space economy with Interstellar Lab founder and CEO Barbara Belvisi. That's coming up on Bloomberg Open Interest on Bloomberg TV. Going to check the markets ahead of the opening bell. And again, this is a big day for SpaceX, of course. And I believe we see Elon Musk, the founder of SpaceX, on stage addressing an audience in Texas. This is going to be listed about the the NASDAQ here in New York and Texas as well. Fewer than 4 minutes to the opening bell. We begin the trading day with Seema Shah here in just a minute. But before we get there, just want to note what we're seeing in markets more broadly here. This is a story of hopes and dreams. I think definitely on the SpaceX side, investors buying into what Elon Musk is selling. We shall see how much they do that going forward. The other hopes and dreams have to do with this prospective deal with Iran and the U.S. Bloomberg reporting this morning there's progress on a memo of understanding that could end what we have seen over the last 100 days, conflict in the Middle East. Of course, the Strait of Hormuz being closed. S&P futures up slightly, about 1/3%, as we await the start of trade for SpaceX on the NASDAQ. This is Bloomberg. We are moments away from the start of trading. This is Bloomberg Open Interest. I'm David Gurra, taking a look here at futures just seconds before the market opens today. And we see a lot of green on the screen, not by a huge magnitude here, but so much interest and enthusiasm for what SpaceX is going to do in just a few minutes' time. That is begin trading on the NASDAQ. Of course, we've seen a lot of stocks rise in concert with that, particularly the Magnificent Seven stocks, taking a lot of the draft that has been given them by SpaceX going forward here. Looking at the bell ringing today, a disparity, of course. One has to say that. Fifth Third Bank ringing the bell at the New York Stock Exchange. Yay for Fifth Third Bank. But of course, our primary focus is on SpaceX and what's happening at the NASDAQ. Yes, in New York City, down in Times Square, but also in Texas, where Elon Musk is addressing his legions of fans and investors as well, ahead again of the start of trade here on Wall Street. Vonnie, over to you, as I know you have some stocks to watch on this Friday morning.
You were talking about the Mag 7, David Ben Emmons talking about the Orbital 7 today, right? And of course, they have overtaken all of the other 7s by a long shot just over the last few weeks alone, with several of them up several hundred% over the last year. These particular stocks, though, are AI related because, of course, the AI trade is back with the SpaceX debut. Shares popping earlier on the prospect of a US-Iran deal as well. Now, the gains have since subsided, except for Alphabet, which of course has a major stake in SpaceX and basically benefits if SpaceX does well. And even if it doesn't, Alphabet just stands to win either way, David. Yeah,
I want to point to some space-linked stocks ahead of that SpaceX debut, ahead of when SpaceX begins to trade. Market liquidity top of mind for investors as they free up capital from mega debuts from SpaceX, OpenAI, and Anthropic. Look, at the top of the show, just about half an hour ago, it was a mixed picture. Now we see a lot of those stocks down. Again, I think there's just a level of, I don't want to call it anxiety, but a moment to wait and see sort of how this kicks off for SpaceX. But as we'll talk about over the course of the next hour and a half, Vonnie, really a lot of companies involved in this industry watching very closely as this debut happens on the NASDAQ.
And as you might imagine, he's actually live streaming this on X right now as well. There's going to be a lot of cross-platform advertising.
Cross-platform, exactly. All right, joining us now is Principal Asset Management Chief Global Strategist Seema Shah. She's here with us, along with Ed Ludlow, of course, the anchor of Bloomberg Tech, who remains with us here on set in New York as well. Seema, let me just start with a broad question just about how you're feeling about all of this. You can talk about SpaceX in specific if you'd like, but clearly there is so much optimism, hope. I said hopes and dreams just a moment ago. How are you thinking about this day in markets?
Yeah, hi. It's it's an interesting day. There's as you said, hopes and dreams, I think, is the right way of putting it. And actually, I've never felt more irrelevant as a macro strategist as today with given SpaceX. But overall, I think the broad market sentiment is positive. It has had a very deserved pickup. We've seen the last couple of weeks amongst clients, you have had some pessimism really starting to creep in around the Iran war. So today, very good news on that front, and I think at least takes away some of the fears, even if it doesn't necessarily give the market a very significant boost at this stage.
Just on that point, Seema, it did seem to be a huge U-turn yesterday, just before the market closed, right? That the president came out and said he was calling off what would have been a third night of strikes. Why should we believe that we're any closer to the Strait reopening today than we were yesterday at this time?
No, absolutely. It's a great question. I think that's a question that everyone is asking themselves. I think one thing that we can say, though, is that just looking at the trend of the conversations is that you haven't seen a real escalation in tension. So even as you have a kind of a war of words, something happens, you don't really see an escalation in terms of the actual military actions. So I think that's giving us some confidence. But I think you're absolutely right that in terms of having a lot of confidence in how sustained this news is going to be is questionable. And it's one of the reasons why you continue to say from investors that they just want to have a big picture view of the economy, and it's certainly helped by the fact that the fundamental picture is still really supportive. So you can be risk on, maybe look away from the Iran war, look away from the headlines, and just stay invested through all of that.
Ed, I could use any number of superlatives to describe this IPO. I know you've had to do that over the course of this week and past weeks as well. But as we look at Elon Musk, they're surrounded by many hundreds of people. I saw a statistic that I think 4,000 SpaceX employees, past and present, are poised to become millionaires here as a result of this IPO. And I'm curious how you think about the ramifications of that going forward. Yes, there are going to be some very rich people who are calling up their brokers and looking for ever more expensive houses in San Francisco and the surrounding area. But what does it mean for the tech industry very broadly and for the space industry as well?
Yeah, I mean, maybe Seema sells herself short on there is a macro level impact here. One thing I would say is that SpaceX employees over a number of years have had multiple liquidity opportunities because SpaceX does what's called a tender, offers the opportunity for insiders to sell shares to give them liquidity, but none of them left. They're still there. The thesis that's presented to me by the most loyal investors of SpaceX is that those millionaires don't sort of go to the beach for the rest of their lives. They don't ditch SpaceX when the lockup ends. They become venture capitalists or founders themselves. That story already exists in Southern California in particular, where around Hawthorne there is a great ripple effect and an ecosystem of startups literally born out of SpaceX. But yeah, the macro level effect as well is if you could just do this for me, just ask Seema about it. The point is this is the biggest IPO in history. It's just the beginning of SpaceX tapping the capital markets in every guise, and not just SpaceX, everyone.
Yeah, I just want to mention that space-related stocks have taken a turn lower now, and you see the likes of Redwire and Lunar and SATS and so on down 4% and 5% apiece. Now, they did gain quite substantially yesterday, but if you look at Hyperliquid, we're also seeing that premium for SpaceX shares just come off a little bit. So we will be obviously monitoring the situation. It's going to be a volatile day, we know that. Seema, can I come back to you and ask you generally about IPOs? Do you tend to have clients enthusiastic about IPOs, or do you always want to wait until they're included in indexes and until maybe 6 months down the road when more capital raises or lockups have expired?
Look, I think it's a very, very mixed picture. I mean, with this one specifically, you can imagine that the clients are very, very split on how they feel about it. You've got some which are real believers and are willing to look away from some of the balance sheet numbers, which are concerning, and then you've got others who are really focused on that balance sheet and really don't want to have a look into it. I think the one general positive point, though, that we're getting from everyone is that this is really good news to see this wave of IPOs back into the market, and that just gives a lot of confidence once again to the public market, which I think to some extent had been waning in previous years.
Can I ask you lastly, just to kind of dovetail this with the inflation story, of course, a really big one over the course of this week, aside from the SpaceX story here, but getting that underwhelming read of inflation from the U.S. government. Looking at what the ECB did earlier this week, raising rates, sort of help us understand the broader economic moment, the kind of cauldron in which this is happening.
Look, I think this is a really, really strong moment. There's a lot of volatility and there's a lot of risks. And as you said, specifically, the one thing that Evan's focused on from a macro side is about inflation and how central banks are going to be responding. We feel fairly confident, but again, so much of it really comes back down to the Strait. When is it going to reopen? How much are oil prices going to come down? And that's key. But the basic macro picture, with really driven by the AI capex wave, which is, we can't look away from that for any moment, as well as resilient consumer spending, is I think one of the things that keep investors in the market beyond the IPOs, beyond even the AI tech trade. It's a growth picture, and not just in the US, but of course in Asia too.
Ed, let me ask you, there will be an incentive for this to succeed today. I'm sure bankers will try and do what they can to make that happen. And of course, we've had massive institutional bids and so on. But what would be considered a fail?
Gosh, I mean, the dynamics of whatever hours of trading are left when trading does start are driven by lots of factors. The oversubscription on both the institutional retail side will be very severe. People will be desperate to get in on the IPO and face a decision if the shares that are available are those ones that are in the float. Like, if you're going to sell and buy at a certain point, buy and then sell at a certain point, that's up to you. I think the main takeaway from it is, they had preset a story out. Everyone has had time to digest the story. And however trading happens today, it's probably not reflective of whatever the roadshow entailed, right? It's a future where there are data centers in space, and SpaceX is an enterprise AI company. That hasn't changed since I went to bed last night and woke up this morning.
No, it has not. Our thanks to both of you. That is Principals Seema Shah joining us there, and of course Ed Ludlow, host of Bloomberg Tech. Let's get a check on the stock market right now, because we are seeing some of those gains continue and some of them just come off the boil a little bit. So we have 337 stocks higher in the S&P 500, just more than 100 of them lower. Some positive sentiment in this market for sure. It's not just about the SpaceX IPO. In fact, you could argue that it's more about geopolitical just de-escalation. We don't have an agreement yet. There's the G7 next week. It looks like there's an effort to have some kind of memorandum of understanding signed there. Though, again, there are 14 points on the Tehran proposal that was sent out by MER, the state agency, and it's not clear that some of them won't be red lines for President Trump. So we'll see what happens over the weekend. But of course, this market has its eyes firmly on the SpaceX IPO. And if you take a look, the AI trade is pretty much back. We have the likes of AMD and NVIDIA leading things here, gains of 1% plus apiece. The memory chip makers, after that call yesterday, continue to gain, having gained spectacularly in yesterday's trade. I think SanDisk was up more than 15% yesterday. Alphabet is higher, although if you notice, it is actually erasing some of those gains. And the interesting thing about it is that some stocks related to space and the space trade are seeing massive declines right now. So Redwire, for example, is down almost 10%. And we have Lunar Labs, SATS, and so on. Several of those companies are lower. Perhaps it's money being taken off the table so it can go into the SpaceX IPO when it does actually start trading. Perhaps it's a sell the news event. Perhaps it's just that the space trade is now fully priced, according to people. But we'll see how that progresses throughout the day. So if you look at the sectors in the S&P 500, a little bit like yesterday, you have energy, one of the laggards, this as oil declines on deal hopes, and then interest rate sensitive sectors like financials, real estate, utilities and materials all gaining. Not a huge amount of actual news underpinning this, just a broad sentiment, I would say, today, David.
Yes, broad sentiment, I think, is the overarching story of the trade today. Vani, thank you very much. And coming up, we head to the NASDAQ, where SpaceX investors and executives are celebrating on this historic day. That's coming up next on Bloomberg Open Interest.
It's time now for our top calls. Some of the analyst action in focus this morning. First up, Barclays cutting travelers to a sell, saying profits are getting harder to find as pricing shows and margins are pressured. Next up, we have Adobe here. It's getting hit with multiple downgrades after the departure of its CFO. Stifel, Evercore ISI, Wolfe Research, all citing leadership uncertainty and a clouded growth outlook as reasons for caution. That stock down 8.5% now. And finally, Citi is upgrading AMD to buy, saying the company is becoming a stronger AI chip player and could win more business from Meta. David.
Bonnie, thank you very much. Let's get back to SpaceX on this Friday. The listing is a major win for the NASDAQ with more than $350 billion worth of total demand from investors. For more on that, let's head to the NASDAQ. Bloomberg's Yochai Anand joins us now. Set the scene for us, if you would. We've been kind of going back between Texas and New York, looking at the goings on there. We saw Elon Musk is in Texas. What is happening at Times Square, and what's the latest that we know of sort of when we might see this begin to trade?
Exactly. So while Elon Musk is at Starbase in Texas, there is plenty of celebration here at the NASDAQ. I am still seeing President Gwynne Shotwell behind me, along with CFO Brent Johnson, celebrating along with Adina Friedman. And outside, I can tell you, even from here at the booth in the NASDAQ, I look outside and there are huge crowds forming of people wanting to get a slice, wanting to get a glimpse of history unfolding, David. And I will say what we know from the NASDAQ is that SpaceX will be eligible for trading at 10 a.m. Eastern, though we will see if we get a first trade soon after then.
14 minutes from now, Bonnie.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yahaira, who is down at the NASDAQ and who's hanging out? Any SpaceX staffers? Apparently there are going to be a lot of parties tonight because one way or another, many of them are going to be quite rich.
Exactly. Many investors are going to make boatloads of money, and that is why it's all celebration here at the NASDAQ. And I will also say that even outside, this speaks to Elon Musk's legions of fans. There's a huge crowd outside. And, you know, what's also remarkable is just the amount of demand surrounding this offering. As we've been reporting, $350 billion in order. Retail investors reportedly placed more than $100 billion, while the deal itself was multiple times subscribed. That means a lot of investors who wanted shares may not get as many as they hoped, leaving traders watching closely to see whether that unmet demand then shows up in the market once trading begins. And once it does, I'll be right here.
Yes, you will. Yahaira, thank you so much. That is Bloomberg's Yahaira Anand down at the NASDAQ. Stay with us for final thoughts, because we are going to get some now from Bloomberg Tech co-host Ed Ludlow. Ed, as we get closer and closer to the first print, right, are we getting any more information about who is buying? We know institutional buyers put in orders for massive amounts, but that may not have been because they wanted massive amounts, right?
Everything that's happened to this point is exactly as was foretold and expected. So, like, a large amount of the institutional allocation went to long-only asset managers. We knew that would be the case. Our reporting was, why did they set $135 price prior to a roadshow and keep it? Because Musk and SpaceX management wanted to remove the leverage of the institutional market, where a range allows them to come in and say, look what I can do. Look at my economic power in this point. The retail point that Yahaira just made, super interesting, because management at SpaceX believe that the retail investor understands their story so much better than Wall Street does. Wall Street, I know you're watching, sorry, that's the state of play. And it's highly analogous with Tesla. They believe that the retail investor would hold the shares for the long term, right? Just as Tesla retail shareholders have done. 20% might be lower than people maybe thought. There was reports of 30%. That hasn't happened in the end. How they play the open market, very interesting.
You stared down the barrel and talked to Wall Street directly. Talked to Sand Hill Road as well. Andreessen Horowitz, Sequoia, Founders Fund. All of these folks stand to make a lot of money here as well. How are they thinking about this day and what it means for VC investment going forward?
You know, for the LPs of those venture firms' funds, they'll be delighted. In Andreessen Horowitz's case, this will be the biggest return in the company's history. It's actually the second most capital they've deployed. They put more into Databricks. Founders Fund is going to come up with like 50 billion stake. What's interesting is those venture firms, you assume that when they are excluded from lockup restrictions, that they sell, they liquidate. Doesn't necessarily work like that. Like, they'll have a thesis of where they think the true value of the company should be, and whether the public equity matches that value, they'll find out like everyone else.
Ed, thank you very much. Ed Ludlow, co-anchor of Bloomberg Tech, of course, following this very closely when that trading begins. I know he'll join us again to get us up to speed on what's happening on the NASDAQ. And coming up here, leveraged ETFs are on the horizon for retail investors getting risky with SpaceX. We're going to dig into that next. on Bloomberg Open Interest.
One, ignition. And liftoff. Go SpaceX.
We have SpaceX shares indicated to open 29% above the IPO price of $135 in their trading debut. We're expecting them to start trading, in fact, in just under 8 minutes. NASDAQ has indicated that they would be available for trading at 10 a.m. Eastern. A little unusual for IPOs, which typically take a few hours for the markets to get made and for the first trade to happen. That usually happens in the 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock hour. But that's what we're seeing right now, that SpaceX shares are indicated to open 29% above their IPO price of $135. I do want to mention, though, that President Trump has been making comments and that this is also impacting market sentiment. He posted on Truth Social that the attack, apparently a drone attack on an Indian color ship in the Strait of Hormuz last night, was unacceptable. He said that Iran would need to get its act together, and this is causing oil to spike, with Brent very close to $90 once again. We have yields at their highs of the day, the 2-year yield at 409. The VIX is trading back above 19, and stocks are at their lows of the session. The S&P 500 reversing those gains, down about 0.25% now. A wave of leveraged ETFs tied to SpaceX are set to launch shortly after today's IPO. Let's discuss with Bloomberg Intelligence ETF analyst James Seyffert. More of these bullish and bearish, double and triple leveraged ETFs, James. How come they're getting to market so quickly after the IPO?
Yeah, I mean, we actually had an example with the Cerberus IPO where, as you were just talking about, that actually started trading in that 12 to 1 o'clock hour. And we had ETFs launch the next day with the market that were 2x long. So basically, this is just a race for these issuers to get out as quickly as possible, because being first matters, right? And these things are big business. These things tend to charge more than a 1% management fee. When you compare that to a typical S&P 500 type ETF charging 0.03%, like, you're talking a lot of money that can be made on these assets. So these are big business. There's at least 14 different issuers that have filed for these things, and there's about a dozen specifically that are 2x long or 2x short that are likely going to launch on Monday.
As we look at more than 20 of these being filed for, I wonder sort of how emblematic that is of what we're seeing in ETFs broadly. Of course, there's such wide enthusiasm for them, wide adoption of them. As we kind of focus on the uniqueness of the SpaceX story, the uniqueness of the SpaceX IPO, how unique is this, the way that it's playing out in ETFs?
Yeah, so I would say the ETF industry is a huge tent, right? Like, most of the money is still going to those cheap beta, passive, or long-term buy and hold type ETFs. These ETFs are what we would refer to as trading tools. They're virtually power tools for investors to use, so you got to know what you're doing when you use them. And it's a vibrant part of the ETF ecosystem, and it's growing quickly. So our expectation is, like, this is going to be the standard going forward for these big IPOs, whether it's OpenAI or Anthropic next. And it's not unheard of. If you look at Tesla, there are over 20 single stock specific Tesla related ETFs, whether that's covered call to generate income or these leveraged products that are doing 2x long or 2x down. We even have some 3x filings. Our personal view is these things aren't going to launch. The SEC will not allow them to launch, but it hasn't stopped issuers from trying.
Briefly, James, do all of these at some point go to zero?
It's certainly possible they could go to zero or near zero. You got to remember, these things are very path dependent because of the way that they're set up to operate. They go up, they give you a return on a daily basis, and then they reset every day. So they are very risky. I wouldn't say they're necessarily going to go completely to zero, but they can go move a lot if the underlying stock moves a lot.
James, thank you very much. Rockets go up and down, as we know there. So maybe to these ETFs as well. Bloomberg Intelligence ETF analyst James Seyffert joining us here on this Friday. And tune in to ETF IQ on Mondays at 12 p.m. New York time. Coming up in the next hour, Joanne on the latest University of Michigan consumer sentiment read, and Katy Kaminski on market volatility. And we're going to talk about the space economy more broadly with Interstellar Lab CEO Barbara Belvisi. A lot of companies, aside from SpaceX, watching the beginning of trading in SpaceX today, wondering what it might mean for them, for their companies going forward. As we continue to wait for SpaceX to begin to trade on the NASDAQ, you see their NASDAQ on Times Square. This is Bloomberg Open Interest. We're 30 minutes into the trading day with SpaceX shares indicated to open 29% above IPO price in what would be a historic debut. Welcome to Bloomberg Open Interest. I'm David Gura.
And I'm Bonnie Quinn. Matt Miller and Dani Berger are off, and those shares are supposed to be trading in the next minute. And in fact, the 29% would represent a price of about $175 a piece. Elsewhere, though, we have Donald Trump complaining on Truth Social about Iran, so that is also taking some of the positive sentiment out of this market. He said that an Indian ship that was targeted by a drone overnight shouldn't have been targeted. He also said that terms Iran leaked this morning via mail have nothing to do with the terms that were agreed to in writing. So, in fact, those two agreements were not actually synchronized whatsoever. That's sending some fear into this market where the VIX is now above 19, and we have Brent trading at 89.62 once again. But all eyes will be on SpaceX for the next few minutes.
Yes, they certainly are. So we've got SpaceX, we've gotten the negotiations by proxy, that deal between the U.S. and Iran. Some economic data as well. Let me break that for you here on this Friday morning. University of Michigan sentiment data coming out here higher than was expected. Looking at that survey data, came in at 48.9. The expectation was 46. Looking at current conditions, that was a beat as well. And the inflation data, 1 year, 5 to 10 year, also interesting. The 1 year inflation expectations 4.6%. Slightly lower than the 4.9% that was forecasted. Fortunately, we have Michael McKee with us here. He's Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent, watching these numbers pop up in real time. Put them into some context for us here. Mike, we had these. This is the soft data. We had the hard data earlier this week. Go back to the inflation numbers that I mentioned just a moment ago.
Well, the inflation numbers obviously would influence people's views, and the University of Michigan does go up fairly close to the dates, but I don't think they would have encompassed Wednesday's data release. The sentiment number is off its low, and the last month in May, it was at an all-time low, historically low, of 44.8, which surprised a lot of people because, of course, we've had some bad times.
Indeed, we have.
In this country before, but I think part of it is going to be sample size and the fact that a lot of people weren't alive, like when Paul Volcker was the chairman of the Fed. Current conditions 48.4 and Michigan expectations 49.3. They're all still negative and still pointing towards an economy that is slowing down at best. The question is, how far does it go? Maybe this means there's a little pickup in sentiment and people will spend money, or maybe it's just that they interviewed a few people down at SpaceX headquarters who are going to become millionaires today, and they're feeling a whole lot better about things. Good news for the Fed on the inflation expectations numbers, because they do go down 4.6 from 4.8. That is probably a reflection of the fact that gasoline prices have come down a little bit this month, but they're still elevated, and the Fed's still going to keep an eye on it, and it's not going to make any difference in next week's meeting.
No, exactly. Although if it had been a lot higher, then it might have some.
Yes.
Michael McKee, thank you so much. Much appreciated, Michael McKee, our economic and Fed whisperer. Joining us now is Joanne Shah, University of Michigan Surveys of Consumers Director. Joanne, why are people so sanguine about inflation all of a sudden? It seems like this may have been a surprise. Was it a surprise to you?
Not really. Consumers have been seeing a bit of a downtick in gasoline prices over the last few weeks, and consumers absolutely did notice that. So they're feeling a little bit of relief on that, and it shows up in their assessments of their personal finances. However, overall, price levels, inflation, both for gas as well as other prices, are still very high from the perspective of consumers. They're still seeing a lot of risks on the horizon. So overall, consumers still aren't feeling great despite this recent pickup.
Pull back a little bit if you could. Mike McKee giving us that kind of month-to-month comparison there when it comes to the inflation expectations and sentiment in particular, but pulling back a little bit more here. As he said, we've been at the nadir, we've been at this historic low. As you look at these numbers more broadly compared to what we've seen over the last quarter, last half of a year, how do you think about the numbers that we got today?
Very clearly, since the Iran conflict began, consumers have viewed a deterioration in economic prospects. Things had ended 2025, began 2026 on a bit of an upturn. Consumers had been bracing for a worst-case scenario to come out of the tariff situation last year. That didn't come to pass. The federal shutdown ended, and so consumers were on the upswing. But as soon as that Iran conflict began, consumers really downgraded their views of the economy. At first, they weren't really sure if this was going to be a very quick situation like in Venezuela, but now, 3-4 months on, consumers are quite worried that high energy prices, that supply disruptions in the Middle East could become prolonged, and that could pass through to other prices that they face.
Joanne, what have we been seeing in terms of how the preliminary data differs from the final data? Should we expect, much change over the next couple of weeks?
It depends entirely on what happens in the economy, what happens in the world in the next couple of weeks. If we have substantial developments in the Strait of Hormuz that allow gas prices to come down even more, that give people the confidence that that the supply disruptions will be short term, then consumers are likely to upgrade their views. But if these supply disruptions remain in place with no end in sight, it's very likely that consumer views will remain dour.
All right, Joanne, thank you so much for joining us immediately after that data. Joanne Shue of the University of Michigan. Back to SpaceX now and bringing back in Ed Ludlow, our Bloomberg Tech co-host, in fact, and SpaceX due to begin trading very shortly. In fact, Ed, we're getting some kind of indication now that is sending an ETF lower.
Right.
Are we not anticipating that 175 is a much better price than 135?
Well, look, there's going to be a spotlight put on the sector, and in aggregate, longer term, most of the street would say this is good for the space sector. But as you guys know, because of the fast tracking into the NASDAQ 100 and into the Russell 1000, there's going to be by law mandatory rebalancing that takes place. That's a part of it, right? And so somebody's going to have to be a net not best beneficiary of that. $175 indicated, right? It's indicated. I know that this is exciting, but anything could happen. That's part of it. But what I would say, based on my model, $135 IPO price and 1.8 trillion fully diluted at $175 a share, you're looking at like $2.4-ish trillion value. Interesting. And by the way, Musk would hit trillionaire status at that level. So
you're waiting for it to hit that barometer. Help us understand sort of what this digestion is likely to look like. So trading begins, and what are your expectations? You mentioned the fact that this will be in the NASDAQ 100 in short order. I think it's be the FTSE Russell just a few days later.
Yeah.
There is, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, such uniqueness to this IPO. How unique do you think the digestive process is going to be once this begins to trade?
Well, what we know, the mechanics of it, the allocation to retail was about 20%, and the remainder of the IPO went to largely long-only asset managers, and we knew that that would be the case. It's very interesting because, on the existing cap table of the company when it was private, it wasn't just venture capitalists that were investors. It had legacy Wall Street mutual funds and financial institutions like Fidelity, etc. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic where all of them in aggregate hold the stock for a long period of time. The digestion piece is more a broader capital markets thing, right? The race for capital. SpaceX has raised $75 billion in an IPO. Alphabet is raising $84 and a bit billion through the equity market. There is complete, I think your guests have been saying this, it is not universally believed that this presages the great IPO window. You might have to make a choice of whether you really think Anthropic and OpenAI could go public in that environment. But
is there any chance that Anthropic and OpenAI change their plans based on what happens today?
I've taken a lot of phone calls in the last week since OpenAI filed confidentially, and it's pretty mixed. There are those that just don't think they'll do it this year. For one reason or another, what OpenAI said officially is that they just want the option. They're assessing their options and looking at it. Anthropic, have been more forthright insofar as Daniela Amodei, the president and co-founder, was on stage with Bloomberg at Bloomberg Tech 72 hours after filing confidentially, which is unusual, let's be honest. And she said, well, why would a company go public hypothetically? It's the only mechanism that they have to raise capital at that level. That's also not universally true. They just did a $65 billion private market round.
Yeah.
Doesn't answer your question, Bonnie, but nothing is certain.
Exactly,
We've been chatting a lot over the course of the last week while you've been in the office, and one thing we've talked about, Ed, is this comparison to how the Tesla IPO unfolded, and we've watched this kind of strange roadshow take place this time around. Mr. Musk alongside Mr. Diamond. I guess virtually they weren't actually on the stage together at their new JP Morgan headquarters here in New York, but he's made the rounds, and we've talked so much about the devoted Musk fans and presumed Musk investors here going forward. How does the pitch that he's making differ? I think that there was a heavier amount of skepticism. Yeah, back in the day, I think there was more skepticism about him and the dream that investors are betting on now. Now it seems like there is a larger body of people who do appreciate the fact that he might not stick to a particular timetable he lays out, but betting on his dreams and prospects is a more viable bet than in the past.
Repeatedly, what people tell me is that SpaceX is a much more diversified business than they are even getting credit for. It's a funny thing to say because let's see where the opening trade goes over. When Tesla went public in 2010, it was a sole player in what was a niche market. Present day, the way that investors explain it to me is that, remember that the car bit of Tesla is not what makes up most of the valuation. So with SpaceX, it is different insofar as they have a monopoly on one business line, launching payload into orbit, but they also are hedging their bets on the AI side into 3 buckets. Space-based orbital compute, the future where Grok, their models, is useful and they sell it to enterprises in the distant future. And in the interim, the third bucket is terrestrial compute. They are a neocloud. Tesla did not have that diversity of business, at the time it went public at all. Not even analogous.
Space-based orbital compute, Vonnie. Data centers in space. That's the short answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Data centers in space and also for rent, right?
Yes.
For all of the infrastructure for rent, and Google is already renting it, and Google has a $6 billion stake in SpaceX. So it's a fascinating one, a little bit like the SoftBank model where you invest in the companies that, you need to do business with. Ed is sticking with us as we await those first trades on SpaceX. We did get an indication of a $175 price tag. That's the latest indication for what the stock could open at. But let's get a check on the broader markets now. Stocks did reverse their gains and they're coming back again now. So we're positive once again on the S&P and the Nasdaq 100. Of course, these were Trump comments. He came out on social media and scolded Iran over leaks regarding the deal. He said that what was leaked, he said, via the Mayor News Agency is not what the US had agreed to. Essentially something similar to what's happened several times in the past. He also said that a drone that attacked an Indian ship, an Indian flagged ship overnight, would have to be answered for. That shouldn't have happened. So that sent oil higher, close to $90 a barrel on Brent. But again, we are off our highs now for oil, and stocks have turned positive once again.
I have a feeling that story, what's happening between the U.S. and Iran, is very much front and center in the conversation that our colleague Anne-Marie Horton is having with the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, in Houston, Texas, at the Bloomberg Energy Security Executive Briefing. Let's take a listen to what they have to say.
It was disastrous for the 90 million Iranians that live under that regime. So that's sort of the broader backdrop.
I guess it's just hard to understand is this a real inflection point, only because the president has said about 40 times since this conflict started that we were close to a peace deal, and then a peace deal.
There are always problems on Earth. There are always problems on Earth. There are always things that we wish to be better, that we want to solve here on Earth, and we should solve them. But there also have to be things that get you excited about the future, that make you glad to wake up in the morning, because you can't wait to see what happens next. And that's the future that SpaceX wants to bring to you.
Elon Musk speaking earlier, and let's get a check on these markets, because it's the markets that do that for me, I have to say. And we are reversing once again. We have stocks positive now. We got a little scared earlier when President Trump came out and said that Iran shouldn't have leaked anything regarding a proposal that the US and Iran might sign on to, and those details, some of them at least, were not what the US had agreed to, and we had stocks drop. Now we're back into positive territory again, with the S&P 500 up 0.25% and the Nasdaq up about 0.1%. Brent crude still around $90 a barrel, but down 1.4%, and the VIX, while it had traded higher, is now back just under 19. We're also keeping an eye on yields, because they are staying higher too. The 2-year yield almost at 4.10, the 10-year yield at 4.50. And bear in mind, we also got the University of Michigan sentiment data as well. The inflation expectations in there were actually better than forecast, and sentiment itself did also come in better than forecast at 48.9. Joining us now is Katy, Chief Research Strategist at AlphaSimplex. Also continuing with us is Bloomberg Tech co-host Ed Ludlow. And now we also bring in Bloomberg Chief Wall Street Correspondent Sri Natarajan. Katy, let me come to you first. How much of a risk event is today's SpaceX IPO for this market?
I mean, you can see it's definitely the market wants to be risk on today. It's been trying to, it's been back and forth, but it is very interesting to me, the cross asset relationships that we're seeing today. The fact that yields are up, to me, suggests that there is some sort of liquidity effect today, some rotation to make room to rotate into SpaceX. So I think that's something to think about, especially with oil prices down. You'd expect yields to be down as well. So it's an interesting cross-asset day today.
Sri, let me turn to you just to ask about how the banks are watching what's unfolding here. I could go through the list of all of those that were involved in this transaction. That would take me about a minute's time, and I think it involves pretty much everybody on Wall Street. But what is the marker for success for them? We talked a little bit about the roadshow and how unique it's been here. How have they approached this IPO, and what does it tell you about what the next big ones are going to be like?
Well, IPO days are always interesting, right? Because if the stock has too much of a pop, that is also not necessarily a very good thing for banks, and they get criticized by all the early venture capital investors and startup companies as to why they left money on the table. But in this case, when we've seen demand exceed, $350 billion when they're trying to raise $75 billion, yet the banks, the company has decided to stick to the $135 per share pricing, stick to raising $75 billion at that $1.8 trillion price. And the early indications we seem to be getting are that you could expect a 20-25% pop, which in this case might just be the sweet spot, because this is going to be a very closely watched IPO, not just in the next few hours, but in the coming weeks, because of the interesting quirks in this one. Even if there is demand, you have to think about the fact that retail allocation is way higher than what you're used to in your normal IPO at the low 20s, is what we're talking about, right? In the low 20 percentage points. Then you think about the fact that there's that 5% that Musk has set aside for friend and family. How are they going to trade after the company goes public? You can't really predict retail behavior the way you can predict your institutional clients. So there must be some level of nervousness, especially for bankers at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley who are leading the show.
On the left side,
and the 21 other banks who are involved in this party.
Exactly. Katy, let me ask you, the AI trade more broadly, is it still on? And if it is, then why are some areas trading lower and trading down when earnings don't excite investors, and other areas are just booming again, like the memory chip makers?
I mean, this is a good question. We've seen a lot of rotation, particularly this week, and it's really about sifting through the winners and losers and rebalancing portfolios, especially considering how concentrated most investors are in this AI trade. So I think it's a natural next phase of the AI trade. And I think today is just sort of an interesting day to see how that kind of is a catalyst for potentially more shifting going forward.
Ed, let me just ask you about where this company goes from here. So this is a company that says its only limiting factors, as I understand it, are the laws of physics. And I'm just going to meditate on that for a moment here. But you've laid out for us so expertly what the aspirations of this company are. But there are so many caveats in that prospectus about the timeline. And again, talking about Elon Musk, a timeline is always kind of a fuzzy and fungible thing here. But what does this company have to prove, not today, not Monday, but in the months and immediate years ahead?
There is a lot more in the immediate future that we haven't discussed at all this week, which is Starship, as is outlined in the risk factors.
Has to have a successful launch.
It has to work.
Yeah.
This system, the idea that there will be a constellation of satellite-based data centers is predicated on a launch system that can carry a certain 150 metric tons of payload to orbit. Okay, right now Starship on paper can do 150 metric tons, but they've never done that. They've never launched it, both the lower half launch system and the top half spacecraft, and then re-landed both back on planet Earth because the economics require it to be fully reusable. So, in an interview, Gwynne Shotwell, the president, on another network, basically said that happens soon, the 13th and then 14th test flight. But what's also really interesting is in the prospectus is listed Customer A. Who is Customer A? It's the government of the United States in various guises. They are on the hook for a big chunk of NASA's plan to get America onto the moon using Starship. So there's pressure on them to do this now, right, in the weeks, months ahead. And then last thing, just real quick, why does SpaceX raise $75 billion? It needs money, it needs capital, pay off some debt, they'll use debt again, but also capital expenditure, right? If you asked me earlier, what's the one question that if we could ask, what's your CapEx, like right now and into next year?
Sri, let me ask you that because, Bruce Richards was on earlier talking about how this was an investment-grade company and so on. And of course it is. There's a lot of pressure on the bankers to make this a successful debut, right, and a successful company and to have them be able to come back to the market. How long, though, before we can really discover what any kind of true valuation is?
And look, that's why I go back to important for debut and beyond. Yes, timelines can be fuzzy and fungible for Elon Musk, but not for the bankers. They have a lot more credibility at stake. And so when Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley go and tell investors that this is a company that made $20 billion in revenue last year, but by 2026, 28, it'll get to $160 billion. By 2030, we're talking about Morgan Stanley predicting $320 billion, Goldman Sachs predicting $470 billion, and by 2040, Morgan Stanley predicting $3.4 trillion. That is a lot of hopes and dreams, and they really need to make sure that Elon Musk executes because it's their credibility on the line. They are the ones who are going out there and telling investors this is a company that they need to invest in, this is somewhere they need to put their money, and they can't be that far off the mark. And there is a big risk. Again, 2025 SpaceX revenue was $20 billion, same as Dollar Tree. Yet the valuation it is seeking today is $1.8 trillion, which is more than that of Meta, which has revenue of $200 billion. So you can see the big credibility risk here. The bankers will, of course, tell you that when Elon puts his mind to it, he always succeeds. Ed has mentioned this multiple times this week, that Elon may get there eventually, but not on the timeline that he originally sets out. That might not be a satisfactory answer for the clients of the banks who are trusting the banks and their projections here.
Print that Dollar Tree stat out and hang it in a museum. Katy, let me turn to you lastly on a morning when we're kind of marrying hard data with soft data. We did that with inflation and inflation expectations. Let's just talk about broader sentiment surrounding this debut that we're seeing at the NASDAQ. Today we've seen the Magnificent Seven kind of rise in kind leading up to the debut at the NASDAQ today. Talk about the ramifications of that. There's a lot of skepticism, yes, about this company, a lot of skepticism about AI as well. How much is that skepticism being allayed by what's happening here? How much of it is still kind of roiling beneath, do you think?
Well, I think, it's an interesting time to be looking at this type of event because really we're also still grappling with a lot of geopolitical uncertainty. And you're in a situation where investors have tried to decouple the AI narrative from what's happening geopolitically. And I think, given what we've seen this week, as you've seen some skepticism about this tech or about the AI move, I think this is a very key data point for many investors to understand how should they think about positioning. I think today, for me, it's really a liquidity question. It's where are people taking assets out? Like, where are they adjusting their positions to make room for SpaceX?
Katy Kaminski, thank you very much. Katy Kaminski of AlphaSimplex, Ed Ludlow with us here on set, Sri Natarajan with us as well, of course, our chief Wall Street correspondent, and Vani continuing to watch, yes, that ticker not moving, the SpaceX ticker, as we await trading to begin on NASDAQ. And looking at markets more broadly, we see them having some lift here over the course of the morning as trading gets underway in earnest. The other story that we're watching here, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well, what happened with this Iran deal. It seems like we're living through this kind of Groundhog Day moment once again, where we're hearing one thing from the administration, and then the pushback that we're getting from the Iranians is telling a very different story. Our colleague Anne-Marie Horton down in Houston talking with the Energy Secretary right now. I should say, if you'd like to watch that, it's at Live Go on the Bloomberg terminal. But really kind of a dissonance in messaging even from the president's energy advisor and what the president has been saying to reporters over the course of the morning, what he's been saying to all of us on Truth Social as well.
Well, and the reason it's so important this time around is because it really did move markets. So we saw an almost 5% drop in oil prices, and we're still down, but only by 1% now. The market will be waiting until this piece of paper is signed in full view.
And what Bloomberg has been reporting over the course of the morning is there's some movement, some push to get that done on the sidelines of the G7 meeting, which is taking place Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of next week. Just about 60 miles as the crow flies is Geneva, where that might be signed. So we'll see what happens there. The president has said his vice president might be the one to do it when, in fact, that comes. Well, coming up here, we're going to speak with Interstellar Lab CEO Barbara Belvisi about the future of life beyond Earth. That conversation coming up on Bloomberg Open Interest on Bloomberg Television.
I give SpaceX less than a 10% chance of succeeding at all, to be clear. In fact, I told people this. I said, look, we're probably going to fail, but, we should give it a try because If we don't, if there's not a new company that enters space, we will never be a truly spacefaring civilization.
SpaceX CEO Elon Musk speaking earlier, and I want to point out that SpaceX shares are indicated to open now at $174 each. The IPO price was $135, therefore that would be a 29% increase from the IPO price. Let's head back now to the NASDAQ, where Bloomberg's Yahira Anand joins. So, Yahira, who's down there from SpaceX, and what are they all talking about? How excited are they?
Hi, Vani. Well, I am still seeing Gwynne Shotwell, the president of SpaceX, here at the NASDAQ. But the real action is outside, because it's actually pretty quiet here inside at the NASDAQ now that we got the opening bell out of the way. But you can see a huge crowd outside, people taking photos, trying to maybe catch a glimpse of Elon Musk, though he isn't here. He is obviously over in Texas. But as you said, we're getting, our first real indication of where SpaceX could begin trading. And right now, the stock is indicated to open around $175 a share. Remember, the shares were priced at $135. And if those indications hold, it would be a powerful debut for a company that until now had been off limits to most public market investors and those retail investors that have been following Elon Musk. And what's remarkable is what that does to the valuation SpaceX. But at $175 a share, the company could be worth about $2.3 trillion.
Yahira, thank you very much. That's Bloomberg's Yahira Anand joining us from the NASDAQ down at Times Square. As she mentioned, Elon Musk not there. He's in Texas. There is a kind of split group of executives as all of this unfolds. SpaceX leading the way for other companies in the space industry. Let's get to Bloomberg Global Space reporter Lauren Grush. Lauren, Ed made fun of me earlier for having read this prospectus, but there was something in it that I want to ask you about. Mm-hmm. That is Kardashev Type 2. This vision of a society, another society benefiting from a star or sun of its own. Mm-hmm. There were all of these dreams here, and I bring that up only because there are so many companies that are also part of that dream, and thinking about the way that's going to change life for all of us, change the economy more broadly as well.
Absolutely. I think a lot of focus on all this discussion about the SpaceX IPO is, what SpaceX has actually done, revolutionizing, reusable rockets, sending people to space on a commercial vehicle.
It's fantastic.
Well,
and I mean that in a non-derisive way.
But I think another thing that also the company showed is that, a company like this could exist prior to SpaceX. The main companies that were working on space were these large defense contractors. They were very, they weren't vertically integrated, but SpaceX came in and said, we're going to be vertically integrated. We're going to slash costs. And they have since, installed themselves as like kind of the backbone of our space program. So I think what they really did was kind of pave the way for other companies to come along like them and try to replicate that success.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask you. Is there room for all of these companies to survive and thrive, right? The ones that are making rockets, the ones that are making equipment to bring to space, the ones that are making food to eat in space and so on. Mm-hmm. Does it float all boats?
Yeah, I was going to make that same comparison to a rising tide, right? And we've seen, a great proliferation of space companies since SpaceX had its great success. We have Rocket Lab, Firefly Aerospace, other launch providers that are also trying to be a bit like SpaceX in terms of having a very diversified portfolio that relies on space. Obviously, when it comes to competing with SpaceX, it's still pretty tough on a lot of fronts. They hold something of a de facto monopoly on the heavy lift launch market right now with their Falcon 9 rocket. Other companies like Blue Origin and the United Launch Alliance, they have their own competitors, but they aren't as, they don't launch as frequently. I don't know if you saw, but there was a massive explosion of one of Blue Origin's New Glenn rockets. Just goes to show that, building these vehicles is difficult. They are prone to explode if you don't take the right precautions. So, other people are trying to catch up, other companies are, but it is just a really, they started very early, and so it might be hard to catch them, as Gwynne Shotwell has said.
I just want to point out that we've had two indications in the last couple of minutes, down to 172 and then 170. Mm-hmm. So right now, SpaceX shares are indicated to open at 170. That price coming down from 175, Lauren.
Interesting. Well, it's still a really high share price, I have to admit. I mean, and one thing I keep saying is that it really is hard to understate the value that SpaceX provides to not only the commercial space industry, but the U.S. government. They are perhaps NASA's most important launch provider at the moment, and also just partner in general. Without SpaceX, we would not be able to get humans into orbit from, or to the International Space Station from U.S. soil. And then on top of that, they are also one of a few elite launch providers for the Defense Department, for the Pentagon. So, you know, it's that kind of value is hard to quantify.
Well, they do bring in 70% of the revenue for the whole company. I don't think anyone has a problem with SpaceX itself. I think there's more of a problem with the whole AI add-on. Right?
Absolutely. And, you know, I'll admit I was a bit surprised at this new approach. For much of SpaceX's history, Elon and Gwen have said, you know, we are not going to go public until we're regularly flying people to Mars. At least Elon said until the Mars vehicle is flying regularly. So maybe we can subjectively say that these test flights, you know, qualify there. So yes, it definitely is a big new direction for the company that has been pretty consistent on what it's been founded for. So it really is just going to be up to people if they think that, you know, SpaceX can replicate the success that they've had with their launch business, but for AI.
And the U.S. government, customer A, I believe is how Ed put it there just a few moments ago. Lauren Grush, thank you very much. Great to see you here in New York. SpaceX's debut is shining a spotlight on the growing space economy, but building a space economy takes more than just rockets. Interstellar Lab is working on technology designed to grow food and support life on space stations, the moon, and eventually Mars. Founder and CEO Barbara Belvisi joins us now. Barbara, great to have you with us. You heard what Lauren was talking about just a moment ago. I'm curious what this ecosystem looks like broadly. This is a day on which we are focused on one company in particular, not to belabor the metaphor, but if there were a solar system, SpaceX seems very much to be at the center of it, and so much is orbiting around it. What is that community like? How much opportunity is there as you see it?
Well, I mean, it's a very important day for the entire industry. You know, we're proving to investors that a company that started with a mission to make life multiplanetary has been proven to be able to, you know, generate revenue, go public, satisfy investors, and make a lot of people very rich by investing in this company. So it's a huge, it's a shifting point in the space industry because there's going to be a pre-SpaceX IPO and a post-SpaceX IPO for all the startups ecosystem. For us, what it means, we're a big group of people working on the technology that will help life become multiplanetary, and it goes through, you know, orbital space station to the moon, the cislunar economy, and how we bring all of that onto Mars. So,
yes, how does it work? You're identifying foods that will survive, or you're creating foods and other materials, and is it just for human consumption?
So initially we started 7 years ago from NASA Ames in San Francisco. We worked on a conceptual lunar greenhouse that can be applied in the future for Mars. And of course, when I started, I have a financial background. You know, people were like, who are you going to sell this greenhouse to? There is nobody on the moon and neither on Mars. And I was like, well, we're going to spin off the technology and find application on Earth. So from the lunar greenhouse concept that we developed, we did a technology transfer, and we built terrestrial greenhouses that are very efficient and that we sell to ingredient company. Our biggest customer has been L'Oreal, so a cosmetic company buying our greenhouse. We sell the equipment, they pay us services to operate the system. That's how we make money. Then we keep on going with the NASA program. You know, we're very dependent on the rockets, on the landers, on what's NASA direction. And so, you know, we've been for the past 7 years, people were like, you're a little bit early on the market. Well, it feels like now I'm not early, I'm actually right on time because this is about to happen with the moon base. And so, yeah, so we have the infrastructure, the equipment, and in terms of selecting the crops, where we build a database of over 150 different species, we know how to grow, you know, from microgreens to perennial to dwarf trees, and being able to provide a very diverse diet to astronauts in space. One part that is important about the greenhouse is not only about the food, is really about the oxygen and the CO2. Because with 50 square meter of controlled environment greenhouse, you can actually produce all the calories that are needed for a human to live in space, but most importantly, you cover the oxygen need, you recycle the CO2 into oxygen, and you purify all the water. So it is like pods, machine, greenhouse full of life. They are actually the life support system for future human exploration.
Fascinating and so critical. Just want to flag a headline here. SpaceX shares indicated to open out $168.75 each. The IPO price, of course, $135. So again, we see that. I keep saying digestion, maybe not the best word to describe that, but people are processing it. You know, figuring it all out.
Are you processing it? Yes.
Yeah,
it's
processing
really
it real
hard
time.
not to pun today.
Yeah,
I mean, everything is a pun. Even, you know, I was going to ask you about your seed rounds, and obviously.
But you mentioned timing. Can I just ask you about that really quickly? Because it seems like you're so dependent on what these rocket companies are able to do, what their timeline is going to be. And again, going back to that prospectus, there is such a note of caution in there about how the timeline might not hold, things might move back.
Yeah.
How does that impact your business, just not having a clear, defined sense of when this is going to be a viable enterprise?
Yeah, well, very early on, we decided we need to have a terrestrial business because we cannot be, a company is not sustainable if you're not able to generate revenue and have customers. And it was, it's very hard to predict the timeline when everything's going to be ready and when, the Artemis plan will go full on, having Jared Isaacman completely accelerated the path during building the moon base. And so we needed to have a sustainable business model. And currently, the only sustainable business model we can have it on Earth. Right. There is a big need for, very advanced greenhouse system to produce much more efficiently food and different plants. And so that was our way to go. So trying to build the independence from the space program while being ready when it's going to happen.
When the time comes.
It's a fascinating story,
yes.
And I presume it means that astronauts won't just have to eat ice cream on space.
Yes, freeze-dried ice cream out of a package.
Exactly. Well, the very best of luck, and we do want to keep updated from you, Interstellar Lab founder and CEO Barbara Belvisi there. Let's get a check on these markets now. We've seen a volatile morning. I mean, it is Friday. We are also anticipating SpaceX to start trading, and the indication there currently is that it will open at $168.75, so above the $135 IPO price. But I do want to mention that we've seen stocks up and stocks lower today after President Trump said, essentially chastised Iran for a leak of the memo that he said was not what the US had signed on to. At the moment, the S&P 500 is up 0.2%. The Nasdaq 100 is just turned positive. It is up 22 points. The VIX is trading with a 19 handle. It's been higher and it's been lower today. Gold trading below $4,200 an ounce. And Brent crude, perhaps that's the one metric that really tells us everything we need to know. It is trading just above $89 a barrel, so lower, but not by as much as it was early this morning, David.
Yeah, let's get a look at some single stocks moving at this hour, kind of sticking with the theme that we've had over the course of the show, that is space-linked stocks fluctuating ahead of SpaceX's trading debut. Market liquidity top of mind as investors free up capital for mega debuts from SpaceX, OpenAI, and Anthropic. Looking at Rocket Lab, EchoStar, and Redwire, all down this morning.
Adobe delivering a disappointing outlook and announcing that CFO Dan Durn is set to leave the company on Monday, and that stock is down almost 7% now.
Energy stocks are higher now as oil fluctuates again. I think this is the big metric, the big story for me on this Friday morning, aside from the SpaceX story. That is how the markets are processing what the president has said, and indeed what the Iranians are saying about the prospects of a memo of understanding that Bloomberg is reporting could be signed as soon as Sunday. We'll see what happens.
Coming up, we're going to be heading to Washington for more on that potential US-Iran peace deal. That's next. This is Bloomberg Open Interest. SpaceX shares indicated to open at $168.25 a piece. That would be above the $135 IPO price. I also want to mention that our blog, our T-Live blog, is open for anybody to follow along as we await the opening trade for SpaceX. Once again, right now, that indication is at $168.25. The earliest indication we had was $175, so coming down. Broader stock market-wise, we've seen some volatility today. Right now, though, we are seeing stocks turn lower once again. It could be on a little bit that IPO price coming down, but also the fact that Donald Trump is chastising Iran and getting a little bit testy again with Iran. Of course, we had thought that it was all over and there would be a memorandum of understanding signed potentially even this weekend. Well, that could be off the table now. So you're seeing stocks lower once again. The S&P down 0.25%. Brent crude trading below $90 a barrel, but it's only down about 1.25%. Let's get the latest now from Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall. So Tyler, we had some truths from the president in the last little while that really changed the mood in this market.
Right, Vani, this morning we've had a lot of fast-moving developments and exchanges between the U.S. and Iran as President Trump came out with this post on Truth Social saying that terms released by Iranian state media are not are not accurate in terms of what's actually in this potential memorandum of understanding. A senior administration official now tells us that this potential deal includes, one, a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, something that we've been tracking from both sides. But we did hear from Iranian state media this morning saying that the waterway will not be restored to pre-conflict flows, seeming to indicate that Iran still wants to retain control over the strait in some capacity, even after a deal is reached. Secondly, the U.S. says that there will be curbs announced related to Iran's nuclear program, including that Iran's highly enriched uranium would be destroyed and removed, and that Iran's nuclear program would be dismantled. What this looks like in practice still remains to be seen. We need those details. Would this mean that Iran's top 3 nuclear facilities would be closed down? These are the sort of questions that perhaps could come in that later phase of negotiations, but any sort of movement or tangible agreement related to Iran's nuclear program in this first memo of understanding would be, of course, rather significant. But importantly, Vani and David, the senior administration official does tell us that the U.S. is standing firm that Iran will not receive any financial relief until it holds up its end of this deal. Earlier today, Iran maintained that they needed to see at least half of their frozen assets unfrozen and sanctions lifted related to oil before they start to talk about those curbs. Again, Iran has not confirmed this side of the reporting, but this is the latest that we're hearing out of the administration.
We have been here before. Tyler Kendall, our Washington correspondent, joining us with the latest, again, on those negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. And returning to our main story of the day, of course, that is SpaceX debuting on the NASDAQ. SpaceX shares now indicated to open at $166 each, came down about $225 there in the last couple of minutes. Vani, the IPO price, of course, $135. We're going to have much more on today's historic debut coming up next, right here on Open Interest on Bloomberg TV.
SpaceX shares indicated to open at $165 a piece. That is the IPO price, 135 plus 30 bucks, but it's down 10 bucks from where we started when we were starting to look at these indications. So once again, the current indication is that the opening bid will be at $165. Let's discuss all of this with Bloomberg IPO reporter Bailey Lipschultz. When the market makers are all coming together and deciding, you know, what the first trade should be, the fact that it's coming down in the indications, does that mean anything, or could it just pop once again when we open?
It doesn't mean a lot. These are very deliberate moves, so obviously you kind of set a bar. Normally you want to see this number slowly inching higher, but I don't think there's anything right now to read into it, because we have seen a number of circumstances where someone comes in with a larger bid or indication of interest. And again, you're matching buyers and sellers, so you also have to have enough shares and enough people wanting to sell the stock to make sure that this trades well. And the other thing that bankers want to see is it open and move up and to the right, as opposed to open at the top and then immediately
Exactly.
fall.
Bailey, use the word normally. How much is that applicable here? This is the largest IPO in history. Need I say that again to everybody who's been watching this unfold over the last few weeks? And the way that it's unfolded is different. We didn't have a range, for instance. How does that influence what we're seeing here today?
We're seeing in real time kind of an experiment, in the sense that Elon Musk came out and said, we're going to raise at this valuation and this is the size. Bankers help pool orders and we'll distribute it from there. The other thing to keep in mind is that we reported about 20% of this IPO was sold to retail investors. So the big question is, retail is not typically part of this indication of interest. Retail is going to be putting in their orders, typically market orders, once it opens. So right now you're really typically seeing the institutions, the hedge fund flippers, the liquidity providers, if I put on my banking hat, trying to help get the stock into a good place where it trades well to start, and then we'll see what happens from there.
Well, and it's fascinating because all these other space stocks have been trading down today, having popped yesterday. So you have Rocket Lab down 8%, even though it's going to get included in the NASDAQ 100. You've Satellogic down more than 10%, Redwire down 7%. But it could be that people are taking out money that they made yesterday to put into the SpaceX IPO.
Yeah, no, it's been something we've been tracking, and it's been kind of hotly debated. Is this an event that benefits AST Space Mobile and Planet Labs and Rocket Labs, or is this an event where everyone says, wait a minute, I actually need capacity to buy SpaceX in the aftermarket? So you can kind of hear from both perspectives, it again is going to be something that we keep an eye on, especially as we start to get some of that retail flow in particular, because these are stocks that are so heavily owned by individuals and not necessarily by institutions.
If I'm sitting at OpenAI headquarters or Anthropic headquarters, what am I watching for as all of this unfolds today, and as I think about what my roadshow is going to be like?
You're really hoping we don't have a Facebook event.
Okay.
So you're hoping that the plumbing gets off well.
Yeah.
You don't want any snags from the NASDAQ side, from the Morgan Stanley side in terms of getting this open and trading. I think the other thing is going to be keeping an eye and ear on the retail allocation process, as well as what institutions are thinking. Did they like the fixed price? Would they like to see a range? And everyone's going to say they didn't get enough stock, but seeing follow through when we do get quarterly updates from these individual hedge funds and like long only managers, seeing who stuck by those allocations as opposed to people who made a lot of money potentially on a first day pop and then kind of exited stage left.
Bailey, great to see you. And I know it's a busy day. You were on the phone when you came here. I know you got calls to make when you leave here, but tracking all of this as we wait for this trading to begin. And again, just reprising what we said just a moment ago here. The latest indication is that SpaceX is going to open at $165 a share, the IPO price, $135. And as Vonnie mentioned just a moment ago, we have seen that number come in pretty substantially here since the start of the show. It was at 175 just a little bit while ago. So we'll see what happens here. As we get a check on the markets more broadly, and we see the NASDAQ and the S&P 500 are both up. The 10-year yield coming in just a little bit. And then Brent crude is something that we've been tracking over the course of the morning. There are these two stories that we're looking at in complement. Yes, it's SpaceX. Yes, it's the SpaceX debut. It's also what the president said at the start of the day about the prospects of some sort of deal between the U.S. and Iran. And as I give you a measure of caution, a caveat here, we have been through this before. The president has said that there's a deal in the offing and nothing has come to pass, or the Iranians have pushed back on it. Indeed, we've heard a differing view of sort of where things stand from Chris Wright, the energy secretary, who, as we speak, is sitting down with our Anne-Marie Horder in Houston. We see Brent crude here below $90 a barrel, which is significant because we haven't seen it at that threshold since the start of this war, now more than 100 days ago. Well, coming up next, a special edition of Bloomberg Tech with 137 Ventures co-founder Justin Fishner-Wolfson, Laffer Tengler CIO Nancy Tengler, and LNF Investor Services CEO Alexandra Mertz. And don't miss our interview with legendary short seller Jim Chanos on Bloomberg Money at 12 p.m. Wall Street time. This is Bloomberg Television.